Hello, everyone. Today we have a special guest, Hollywood Ha. How are you today?
I am fantastic. How are you, True Truth?
I am good. I'm very good today. It's a pleasure having you with us today. Why
Yeah,
don't you tell the viewers a bit about yourself?
absolutely. Thanks so much, first of all, for that welcome. So we are a truther channel, I suppose, if we require a label. We've been on YouTube for some time. The channel that our primary channel right now is called Hollywood Huh? And, essentially we get into topics related to truths that we're discovering in this day and age. Probably our very first video was on the topic of gang stalking, believe it or not, that phenomenon that still pervades aspects of our society. We delve into things from time to time, like the fallen, those who from heaven fell, and their wonderful, dripping with sarcasm there, their wonderful role in what continues to plague us here on Earth. We get into all the, finer truths that are out there, the chemtrails in the sky. We've recently been talking about things like the massive Hollywood deception and related gender confusion deception and so on. All kinds of content on our channel. Thanks again for the welcome.
Not a problem at all. So, a lot of us have been talking about the flood that happened in the 1800s. Do you know anything about it, or would you like to let us know what you know know about it?
Yeah, absolutely. You and I, obviously we've been talking sort of off camera for what, a couple of weeks now? About that topic. I personally, our channel, we're kind of new to the whole phenomenon. We've only recently been exposed to it. There are channels, for example, like conspiracies-r-us that on YouTube that delve into that topic. So we came across some content. You and I got to talking,
right? And
sort of trying to disseminate some of this information. And what a very interesting topic indeed.
It sure is. One of my thoughts when I was watching many of these videos, or while we were talking, is that how did all these homes become buried and not even being noticed, for like over 200 years?
Yeah, and you know what? Let's first of all maybe introduce your viewers to some of these photographs, that exist on. These photographs were essentially, taken from the internet, and what these photographs demonstrate is, first of all, everyone has seen in their communities and when they go on vacation, in Europe, etc., in North America, etc., has seen these what they call historical buildings, right? And in a lot of instances, these historical buildings are at least partially on the first floor submerged in under the earth. For lack of a better term, you will see windows that only the top half or the top 1/3 of the window is peeking out from above the earth. It's obvious that these homes were not designed in this way. Basements weren't really an aspect of architecture during the period that we're being told these buildings were built. And in a lot of instances, you can just plainly see that half or maybe most of a window, or sometimes multiple floors of some of these older buildings, are buried underneath the earth. And in a lot of instances too, these cities, as a part of their kind of reconstruction, some of these cities all over the world, by the way, are digging some of these buildings out from under the dirt, and we're discovering that there are multiple floors of these buildings that were just built on top of, that nobody on the outside anyway, you really wouldn't be able to tell that there are multiple floors of these buildings under dirt, and they weren't designed in that way. They were not originally built in that way, right? So that's kind of how I would describe this, just the general issue of the so-called mud flood, because we don't know that it was a flood, and we don't know necessarily that it was a flood in the form of mud, right? But how I would choose to characterize it is simply that There's a bunch of buildings, and it's a worldwide phenomenon. And I have memories of a child, in the Caribbean where I'm from, of walking past a whole bunch of buildings that it almost looks like, you're walking up a hill, and on one side of the building you can maybe see the entire first floor on the outside, but by the time you get to the other end of the building, 90 or 80% of that first floor is below the earth, right? And you kind of see these things, and you just kind of chalk it up to maybe there was some kind of localized, volcanic activity or whatever that created this hill, while half of this building is under the earth. Because when you go inside, you can see clearly that you literally have to step down to the first floor in a lot of these buildings. But you kind of you see this stuff and you just dismiss it, and you don't bother asking yourself, what the heck happened here? Why is this building half buried? So I have like literal memories, again, in the Caribbean, of seeing that. And, I have very vivid memories, as well, of seeing those types of, that type of phenomenon, if you will, all over Europe and in North America where I live now. So it's odd without a doubt.
Right. And so, when I was growing up and I saw these homes on built, and it was underground and such, I would ask, like, maybe the elders or whatever, why they were built that way. Many of them actually said to me that it's because it was built on a slope, and it's how they built the homes at that time. What do you think about that? Like, what's your thoughts about that? I don't know how true that is, and maybe they didn't know much about it, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, with this mud flood phenomenon, if you will, right? And again, we're just referring to it as a mud flood because some buildings are under the earth, partially. If there was a massive sort of gush of floodwaters or a massive sort of mudslide, we've seen how destructive mudslides can actually be.
Right.
So if these buildings were built, and somewhere along the line, and the suggestion is, or the sort of how the evidence is adding up when you look at these photographs, is to suggest that worldwide, it would seem, all of these buildings got half buried under the earth around the same time, and everyone is sort of estimating that around mid 19th century, about 1850, 1860. Right? So one, if this thing happened globally at the same time, that's a mind twister, if you will, in itself, because there's no real historical account of there being a global event that would have caused this. And it couldn't be your typical mudslide, because your typical mudslide would have swept a lot of those buildings off their foundation. Your typical mudslide would have been way more destructive.
Right.
Most natural phenomenon that we're aware of, most weather-related phenomenon that we're aware of, are so destructive. It's not just going to casually wander in and circle a building and bury the building and leave the building's foundation sound structurally for someone to then come along and build on top of. So we're referring to it as a mud flood, and the suggestion is that whatever it is that happened, was calm enough, or wasn't so violent that the buildings were just destroyed or demolished or swept away. Right?
Yeah.
The idea that, what you just suggested, that these buildings were just built on some kind of slanted foundation or using some kind of slanted system, well, obviously we have to dismiss that the second we look at any of these photographs that we're showing your viewers right now. I'm looking at photo number 1 with the blue, the historical building painted in blue.
Right.
And then somebody comes along and digs away at what was covering up these windows partially, and you come to realize there's an entire floor that was buried under the ground, including doors. Yeah. This is insane. And again, you can see evidence of these types of earth-buried or mud-buried buildings all over the world. So one of the first questions, to tell you the truth, maybe we should kind of get into some of the more, weird elements of this phenomenon, you know, as we've wrapped our minds around it and talking about it recently, you and I. One of the first questions that I asked myself when I was first exposed to this idea, right? And there are other there are other massive aspects connected to just these buildings being buried, right?
Right.
There's a suggestion, first of all, that a lot of these buildings that they're noticing being buried under mud worldwide, they're all very similar architecture, right? They're almost always identical architecture. A lot of these historical buildings all over the world, in a lot of instances, they refer to them as, Greco-Roman architecture. They exist in the United States. They exist in, Canada, where I live. Like a lot of your, old city halls and old parliament buildings and old library buildings and all kinds of historical buildings.
Right.
They are generally, to some significant degree, this type of architecture. And for this type of architecture to have, spanned the entire world at some point suggests that there might have been one civilization that spanned those areas at some point in time. And that's why there's the presence of those buildings that are identical, in Canada and the United States, in places in both North and South Asia, in Russia, in Europe, etc., in the Caribbean, and so on, right? So anyway, what I asked myself when I came across this flooding and a suggestion that there might have been some civilization that, again, there's no real historical account of, that might have built these buildings all over the world because of their similarity, and that some global disaster took place all at the same time that covered all of these buildings in mud, which is why all of this mud flooding is so similar. I said, well, one, is it an act of God? Is it an act of the Most High, the Creator, because it was global?
Right, and that came to mind as well.
Two, is it maybe some kind of, tied into this global civilization, building multi-floor buildings that to some degree look like there are elements of technology that we're not aware of today or that are not utilized today. So was there some kind of war that this civilization was involved in, why they don't even exist anymore, and was the destruction itself some kind of technology-based weapon, if you will, that caused this type of flooding? Or three, was it just a natural disaster? So that was the first question I asked myself. Which of these three things was it? Was it, God, war, or nature?
Right.
And I still haven't answered that. What's your feeling?
Well, with those three options that you provided, I'm thinking more of the line of either it's biblical, God, or warfare.
Yeah, so we might as well introduce those that are not familiar with the idea of Tartary, right? So this civilization that I alluded to a couple minutes ago, the people who are at the front of this research anyway, on this lost civilization, if you will, they're referring to it as the Empire of Tartary, right? The reason they're doing that in part is that there are maps that people are discovering or researching on the internet that suggest that there was a civilization called Tartaria, and that it spanned significant parts, probably up to 60% of the overall landmass of Earth at the time that these maps were made up. Right? So if you had a civilization that spanned more than 50% of the Earth, one civilization, and the suggestion or the evidence is that it is because of these buildings with these weird pyramid type shape roofs, and then what we perceive to be flagpoles, these thin poles, that top off this pyramid shaped building, and that you
Right.
can find this very architecture all over the world, and that in a lot of instances it's this architecture that is half buried in mud. You know, it's kind of leading everyone to the presumption anyway that, again, you know, these people lived all over this earth. They designed these buildings all over this earth. They might have lived in these buildings all over this earth. And these people don't exist anymore. You know, that maybe there's technology tied into these poles that we're seeing on top of this pyramid-shaped roof. We're not familiar with what that technology it isn't being utilized anymore. The people have disappeared. You know, their evidence of their existence or knowledge of their existence has been essentially erased, and it's one big mystery, from the mud to the buildings to this empire to the technology to what happened to them to why we actually don't know about it. At the same time, whenever we are exposed to these ideas that some people refer to as conspiracy, right? Because again, if it can be evidenced that there might have been a global civilization that there's no real proper historical account of, this isn't being taught in schools, right? And if that civilization, either again by an act of God or by some global disaster, was erased, that still wouldn't account for why knowledge of them was erased. So this would fall definitely into the conspiracy realm, right? Right. Or your more ideas that you have to apply your discernment to before you even decide what side of this thing you want to fall on. Right? So we have to be careful. The picture I'm looking at right now, number 3, right? Although it evidences that a building was literally buried underneath a street.
How interesting.
Right? Although it evidences that this building might have been unknown to the inhabitants of this city, which looks like your typical 70s or 80s, maybe even, mid-70s U.S. City, based on the type of cars, to provide this as evidence of this quote-unquote 19th century mud flooding that we're talking about, I'm not sure I would fall in line with that, because one, you're looking at the red brick design. This building isn't necessarily the same type of architecture as in this building here, the one in the first photograph, 0, right? So, you know, I'm not even sure what the source of this photograph is, or if there was any suggestion that this photograph specifically could be added to the debate concerning this 1850 mud flooding. But, you know, it is odd that 2 floors or maybe 3 floors of a building or more, because maybe they haven't finished digging yet, is just literally buried underneath a city. It's odd even if they knew it was there. But you kind of got to be careful, you know, what the source of some of this information is at the same time, right? I'm going to move on to somewhere different for a sec, right?
Okay.
In me personally, right, Hollywood, in researching, again, you know, floors of a church building buried under the mud until it's dug out, right? In researching that, I said, well, let me go and see what does in fact exist by way of historical account. Like what's written down in some textbooks concerning this flooding, right? So you would come across things like, you know, the Great Flood that took place in the United States, by the way, around the same time, late 19th century. But supposedly that flood was restricted to, I believe, the state of California, I believe the state of Idaho. Right? And as well, let me see if I could find a photograph on this issue. Right? No, I don't have the photo here. But this photograph that I'm looking at right now, number 5, is on the internet related to that great flood in the United States.
Right.
Right? As a matter of fact, no, this photograph is related to a 1936 flood that took place in the United States that I believe affected this town called Johnstown, which I believe is just outside of, might be Philadelphia. And what's being suggested there is that in the 1936 flood, a dam broke, upriver, a whole bunch of water rushed in and drowned a whole bunch of people and placed this tree, well, literally, it looks like this tree uprooted the house, or the water uprooted both the tree and the house. Right? So people could come along and say, look, there is historical account that would explain the mud flooding in the United States, because the Great Flood, right, and I don't specifically have any photographs on that as well. The Great Flood, that was, like I said, mid to late 19th century, it affected 3 to 4 states in the United States, right?
Right.
So if you found a mud flooded building in any of those states, someone could come along and say that you can easily explain that because of the Great Flood, and there is ample historical account related to that Great Flood in the United States. The problem is going to be is if you then go over to the UK, and similarly they have a Great Flood over there, and it was around the same period of time, and then you go to Russia and they had a Great Flood in Russia and it was around the same period in time, and then you go to China and they had a Great Flood in China and it was around the same period in time. That's going to turn out to be a super flood that frankly affected the entire world. It's just not in the history books. It's not being positioned in that way. The United States is talking about it as though it was a separate event. Russia's talking about it as though it was a separate event. China, etc., what have you. But it all adds up to the entire world was dealing with flood-related or water-related events all at the same time.
Why are they categorizing it as separate events?
Well, listen, what's being suggested is that there's a cover-up, right? Because again, if there's a lost civilization, a few weeks ago is the first time I heard about it, right? If there's a lost civilization and for some reason it's not discussed, it's not in history books, it's not taught in school, that is a classic cover-up, right? It would beg the question, 1, who were they? 2, where are they? 3, who got rid of them? 4, if it can be suggested that there's a cover-up after they were gotten rid of, why cover up their existence?
Right.
And, so all of those become very valid questions if it can be demonstrated using the evidence of there being like a even if it's positioned like there were individual incidents on each continent around the world. If people can, through their research, collate or tie each of those quote-unquote flooding events together into one global flooding event, and it was mid-18th century, that's massively significant because there's no historical account of that. And then if you add to that this global incident wiped away a civilization, and then the very existence of that civilization is being covered up, again, that's some serious conspiracy, if you will, right? So it's very interesting.
Yes, it is. Going back to the picture number 3.
Mm-hmm.
I know the buildings are not the 18th, 19th century buildings,
Mm-hmm.
but it is quite odd that there is a road that is built right on top of it, and other buildings being built on top of it. You got to ask yourself, what happened there? Why is it that they decided? Why didn't they just knock out those buildings and then rebuild, like the roads and new buildings on,
below on the actual ground. Yeah, I mean it's very interesting. It's very perplexing. It's very weird. It's weird to the point you're asking yourself, how could that be structurally sound to put a road on top of this building like this and cars, you know, a significant amount of local traffic. This looks like your typical main street, you know, where all the traffic has to drive through back and forth on a daily basis, on top of what some would call derelict buildings. It's almost like they didn't know the buildings were there, in all honesty.
Right.
You know?
Now, that raises a question.
Mm-hmm.
Are we living on top of buried people?
Yeah, that's another aspect of this whole phenomenon, as a matter of fact, right? Some of you are familiar because there is historical account of this with this phenomenon that they call the orphan trains, you know, that at least in North America, and I believe it was a global phenomenon as well, we somehow, again around the same period, mid-19th century, we somehow ended up with a whole bunch of orphan children, right? Parentless children. There's some suggestion that some of these children actually had parents, but that there were laws created to separate these children from their single moms, or whatever the case may be, you know, their unwed moms. And so you had all these parentless children that the government took control of, and in a lot of instances got these children together, you know, in the thousands, and put them on trains and shipped them, or I should say trained them, railed them to other parts of the United States, for example, to, I suppose it's being suggested, repopulate some of those areas where the children were being sent. Or, I don't know, maybe it was this whole issue of the new frontier, where there were a lot of areas in the United States that they wanted to populate and develop, and so they would ship off on these, or train off these orphan children in the thousands. Right? So to that issue, it would beg the question, you know, why are there so many orphan children? Or even, why are there so many, you know, unwed parents? Why was it necessary to repopulate, if that's what that was? Well, you could tie that back into this global, either weather-related, war-related, or act of God related event. You know, there's some suggestion that with this whole issue that there might have been what's being referred to as a global reset. You know, there might have been a great deal of death, you know, of human beings being disappeared, and that on some level might kind of explain, or might kind of account for this orphaning of children. And if there was this massive die-off or kill-off or whatever, again, not too long ago, mid-19th century, I would have liked to have known about it, you know, growing up and in high school, etc. And I have absolutely no recollection of that. So it's all very weird. And to your question of, you know, are we walking around on top of dead people? Well, if mud caused massive die-off, or if a lot of people died in mud, then yeah, I would suggest they're still there. Probably be pretty hard to recover bodies from mud that buildings are buried in, right? Very hard.
Right. And there's other people are suggesting, you know, that, you know, there's like other cities underneath the cities that we're living in right now. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, if look at which one of these photos is it? Hang on a sec.
Number 3.
Hang on a sec.
Okay.
Look at number 4.
Okay.
Right? In number 4, if the discoloration on the bottom half of this church building, right? This looks like a cathedral.
Right.
Right? And it looks, again, like your 19th century architecture.
Right.
Right? If the gray, the light gray color of the bottom half, if all of that was covered in mud, or if that's where the level of the mud was until they dug it away, right? That's literally 2 floors of a building. Well, it depends, right? But it's 1 to 2. Yeah, it's 2 floors, because on the left side, around the back, you can see a door leading in.
Right.
And based on where that door is, there's a second floor above it that was almost 100% also covered up.
Right.
So someone built this church, right? And that's another issue, right? These buildings that are buried in mud, the architecture in these buildings that are buried in mud, to me, appears to be way advanced as opposed to what I'm familiar with being 1850s style architecture, which would have been more wood-based, which would have been more ranch-based.
Right.
Yeah, more based on our utilization or the industrializing of lumber as a form of construction material. This is what I'm more used to with respect to, with respect to the pilgrims and the, developing of areas of the United States that were prior barren. Those pilgrims would have went in, those settlers would have went in and quickly constructed wood-based buildings, right? So this architecture that we're looking at doesn't really, line up with that ideal or with that idea, right? But back to what I was saying, if 2 floors of this church was buried in mud, right? Then it's not so much that we're living on top of cities that are beneath the earth, although there is that meme out there as well, with respect to, like I said, we could talk for days with respect to the fall from heaven and that serpent class or subculture, if you will, and again, their massive influence on what continues to go on to this day on earth, although that isn't today's topic. But so, you could tie in underworld and underground civilizations into that topic pretty easily, very easily, right?
Right.
But to this issue of the mud flooding, it's not so much that there are civilizations buried underneath the earth, although one would have to open their mind to that idea as well. It's more a case of you've got a church and 50% of it was under the ground, okay? And 50% of it, we would have to assume, wasn't being utilized. Even if the caretakers of this church building, knew, and they likely would have, once they moved in and were utilizing the top half as a church for service once a week and people walking in on a daily basis, the priest and the parishioners, some of them, and the caretakers would have had to have been aware that they would have heard sounds of some kind. They would, at some point, they would become aware that there are 2 floors beneath where we're worshiping.
Right.
Someone would have likely made their way down there, some way, shape, or form. And it would have been dark and cold and damp. And it makes for good some good horror, classic horror film, I suppose. This idea that there are these 2 sort of mystery floors beneath this church that only a few people are aware of and have access to, and maybe we're utilizing for purposes that have nothing to do with what the top 2 floors were being used for. So again, it's all super interesting, right? And I mean, you and I are again new to this whole topic.
Right.
Right? I don't quickly digest anything, right? So it's probably going to take me years to put all of this in perspective. And so if I were to try to summarize for your listeners right now where I am with it today after being exposed to it a couple of weeks ago, like I said, one, if there was a global event that buried 2 floors of this church and churches like it all over the world or buildings like it all over the world, I would have liked to have known about it.
Yeah.
Okay? And I gotta ask myself why we don't know about it, why it isn't being discussed in that context, or why it wasn't in my high school or my junior high school.
Right.
Right, that's one. 2, if you link that to a civilization that spanned significant parts of the earth, what's up with that? What's the cover up with that? And I'm developing some theories. I might come back on if you'll be gracious enough to invite me, and I might expound on my theories related to that. Like me even suggesting that there might have been a war, and this is the result of it, because it's generally in war that you conquer a civilization and then wipe all traces of that civilization from the history books and from existence. So that's why I'm kind of looking at that as well.
Right.
Right? Then, if you tie in this issue of orphans into this, same thing. We're all the adults. People are tying in these ghost cities into this, or what they're referring to as reset cities, meaning, there are people showing you photographs all over the world, major cities all over the world, where, photography became a thing again in that century. It was a completely different thing from today, where you could just pick up your iPhone and snap, high quality photographs from something that you put in your pocket. Right. But in all of those photographs that were taken in the mid 18th century and so on, the streets are completely barren. They're barren of people. They're barren of animals. They're barren of garbage being picked up or being dropped in the street. They're barren of smoke coming out of the chimneys in these homes and whatnot. So there's the suggestion that there are these major cities all over the world where there's buildings, which someone would have had to build.
Right.
But those people who built those buildings, they're disappeared. They're gone. They're missing. They're not inside their house because there's no smoke coming out of the chimney, etc. So the theory that some of these researchers are developing there is that these are what you would call reset cities, meaning this event that we're somehow trying to understand right now caused mass destruction, if you will, mass human extinction, if you will.
Right.
This might kind of explain the orphan children, although I know you have some questions about that you can elaborate on in a sec. If there was a global cataclysm that wiped away significant parts of humanity, even just in North America, and we don't know about it, and if you can tie that to a lost civilization that was also erased from the history books, that's some insane, for lack of a better term, conspiracy or ideas. And sure, we want to talk about it more if you invite me back.
Of course, most definitely. Just like as you said that I had questions about the children and the orphan train and such, I do indeed. It came to mind, how there was the Katrina, the Hurricane Katrina and everything, and everybody were on top of their housetop, their roof and such.
Yeah.
Being wanting to be rescued, it would be parents and children, mother, father, child, mother and child, father and child. How is it that these children were left without any parents at all? Where are the parents? Like, where, if a parent wants to be with their child, they would be up there on the roof, like with their child being saved, or they would go somewhere with their child to be rescued. How is it that all these children are put in these orphan trains and there are no parents at all?
Yeah,
dumbfounded. I don't understand it. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't, and you would think, like you said, right? If back to my original question, act of God, act of war, or natural disaster, in all three cases, it would have a similar effect on children that it would have on adults. If a flood is going to wash away adults, it's going to wash away children too. If adults are going to climb up onto a rooftop or up onto the top floor of this church, for example, to be saved, there's going to be adults on that top floor as well as children. I know that there's this idea that, they say, the elites get the lifeboats and the steerage go down with the ship, so to speak, when the ship is sinking, and people tend to look at it like women and children get saved first and so on. But if you're talking about a global cataclysm that's just wiping people out left, right, and center, children are going to be impacted by it, to pretty much the same degree that adults would. So you're absolutely right. It doesn't make any sense. And it is at this point that I'm going to throw in the most loopy theory of all concerning this whole issue of the mud flood and Tartaria and these orphan trains full of children and whatnot. Because Hollywood likes to get loopy once in a while too. I suppose, right? Because there's at least the vague idea out there in the truth community that all of humanity, that our lives here on Earth, the answer to your every existential question, why are we here, etc., really just amounts to we're chickens on a farm. That Earth, that humanity on Earth is really just the massive farm, if you will, of some other entity or other. And not necessarily farm in the context of like we use it, you know, where we raise animals and they become adults and we slaughter them and eat their meat and you know, make leather jackets out of their skin and so on. One of the suggestions, for example, is that human beings are being farmed for energy, right? So you can tie in the whole Matrix trilogy right there, that we're being used like a Duracell battery. But if Earth is a farm and humans are chickens or farm animals, which is something we talk about at length on our channel, by the way, you know, then we would at least have to consider the possibility that the so-called reset and that the so-called disappearing of adults and leaving children behind, like we do with our farm animals, was, here it is, people, the loopiest theory of all related to the mud flood, was a wholesale harvesting of humanity. By some other entity. They came in and decided that it was harvest time. And by the way, you know, when you read your Bible and you come to talk about Revelations and the end days and how the story all ends, the whole thing is put into the context of a harvest. The wheat and the tares, two being in a field, one being taken and the other one is left, etc. This is stuff we talk about on our channel all the time as well. So, you know, we would have to at least throw that loopy theory out there as well, that it was a wholesale harvest of some entity or other, and they took the adult beings or the adult farm animals and left the children, and that would kind of explain some of it.
Well, viewers, do you think this is loopy? Let me know.
Yeah, I want to thank you for having me on. It was fun. It was a lot of fun, you know, just kind of like expounding on some of these ideas. I actually have come up with even more ideas as I'm talking about this thing. Like I said, if you invite me back, we will elaborate on all of it.
Well, I really appreciate you being on my channel today, and of course, there is no doubt about it that you will be back on our channel. Thank you so much for taking your time and letting us know about this mud flood in the 18th, 19th century and all your thoughts.
Yeah, Truer Truth channel, thank you so much for having us on Hollywood. All
right. Thank you so much.